Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm going to be talking about the new album from Plaid, The Digging Remedy. Plaid is the IDM duo from England composed of Ed Handley and Andy Turner. Now, back in the day, these two were members of the Black Dog, along with Ken Downey. However, after their third album, Spanners, they broke off and formed their own group, somehow becoming even bigger than the Black Dog, I think. Whether or not they're more deserving of success is beside the point. I've actually found the Black Dog's discography to be more consistently good, personally. But one thing's for sure, and it's that nobody on the market sounds like Plaid. They developed a very unique and unusual style for themselves, making IDM that was usually very lighthearted and strange, often involving other non-electronic sounding instruments, although not always. Almost a direct contrast to the Black Dog's recent style of very straightforward and serious minimal techno. Plaid can often be cheesy and silly, but that's part of their appeal. They're just a lot of fun to listen to. Personally, I think Plaid hit their first 3 albums out of the park. But after Double Figure, they've kind of been struggling to maintain around the same quality level. Since then, their quality's been something of a roller coaster ride with many ups and downs. And to illustrate, I'll just go down their discography so far. This one is definitely one of my all-time favorite albums. Good balance between creative and weird song ideas with great melodies. There's a ton of variety and lots of fun all the way through. I don't think the melodies on here are quite as memorable as those on Not for Threes, but the weirdness is still 100% intact and definitely worth checking out regardless. Here the melodies are much more memorable, although it's not quite as weird. But again, totally worth a listen. Oh yeah, this was a thing. It's worth it for tracks 2 through 9, the Mvuki mini album. I'll admit, this is probably their least interesting effort to date. It's enjoyable enough, got some good melodies, but not nearly on the same level as those first 3 albums in my opinion. Plaid made a soundtrack to an anime film, and it sounds just like you'd expect. Actually, this soundtrack is absolutely freaking amazing, and I really highly recommend checking it out. And another soundtrack. Not better than Tech on Kinkri, but pretty good anyways. This was their comeback after a long hiatus from regular albums, and I've got a lot of mixed feelings on it. The best moments on here are fantastic, but there's also quite a few songs that are just and don't really do much for me. This one is less weird than Scintillate, but this is probably the first Plaid album where I like all the tracks approximately the same amount. Which brings us to this album. I can't really say I knew what to expect going into this album, since Plaid had kind of been all over the place in the last couple of years, but at the very least, they seemed headed in the right direction with their last album, Ricci Prince. I had a feeling that I wasn't going to get something that was up to the same standards of those first 3 albums, but I went in anyways with my fingers crossed that it was going to be a further improvement. So, how did it turn out? Well, I will say this. It does build on what we heard on Scintillate and Ricci Prince. Scintillate had a lot of great moments, but it also had a lot of meh moments, while Ricci Prince was much more consistent, but didn't feel weird enough for their standards. The Digging Remedy strikes a balance between the two. The worst moments here are still pretty good, but just don't stand out as much. And the best moments stand out well and get me excited. I did have kind of a hard time trying to figure out which of these 3 albums was the best, as, again, the best moments on Scintillate are still probably the best, and I do like the consistency on Ricci Prince. But overall, I think out of those 3, Digging Remedy is the best. Again, I don't think we're quite at the point where they've hit the same high as those first 3 albums, but this is definitely their best in quite some time. I'd say since Tech on Kinkri. Or if you want to forget their film soundtracks for whatever reason, then since Double Figure. When it all started up with the track Do Matter, I wasn't really sure what I was getting into. It sounded a lot darker than I was used to, and the melody sounded like Plaid's take on a track from the Tron Legacy soundtrack. And the trend continued with Dilatone, which was very abstract and mechanical. I was thinking, are Plaid changing up their style towards something darker this time around? But then we got Clock, and I thought, oh, now that's the Plaid I know and love. It took a while to really sound like something they would do. I should mention that this track in particular is like a weirder and more non-linear version of the track Hawk Moth from Ricci Prince. definitely one of the highlights on this album. This album did have a lot of other standouts too, like the B had a lot of off-kilter percussion like those on Dilatone, but also a lot of different guitar sounds layered on top of each other and sprinkled around. Basically, any of the songs with guitars turned out to be among my favorites. I always like it whenever Plaid uses more organic sounds in their music. Earlier songs like IN, Rakimu, Missing, Most Arrest-Proof Clockwork, and pretty much all the Tech on King Creed soundtrack work really well for me because of that. On here, aside from the already mentioned The Bee, we have songs like Melifer, which is also kind of a more abstract version of IN. This song in particular starts out fairly simple, but keeps progressing and changing around a lot, but still keeping the emotion intact. The two closer tracks, Held and When, work largely in the same way, filled with guitars and organic textures and slowly progressing and building up. When might be short, but it makes for an excellent closer to this album, unlike Scintilla's ending. Also, the track Lambswood is notable for having some cool ethnic flute noises. Made for a nice touch that just pushed it over onto one of my favorites. And there were some great tracks that focused on the more electronic side of things. I already mentioned Clock, though there was also You Mountain. This song didn't sound like it'd be much at first. Kind of atonal and subdued intro, but it very quickly builds up into some really awesome, like, maybe kind of dubstep influenced breakdown. Now, all that aside, there were admittedly some less memorable songs on here too. Salador, for instance, has some cool arpeggios and does have some warmer pads added on near the end, but overall doesn't do much to stand out from the crowd, and in my opinion doesn't really get good until those pads come in near the end. Reeling Spiders also isn't much of a standout either, though I do have an easier time getting into this one. Would have been right at home among the Ricci Prince lineup. Then there's the track Baby Step Giant Step. I don't know about this one. It just doesn't really do that much for me. It's distinctive enough, I guess, but maybe it's because it's surrounded by two far better tracks or something. This one just kind of disappears from my head after it's done. Probably the least interesting track on this release, in my opinion. But at the very least, I do have to appreciate, first of all the less memorable moments are still better than the mess stuff from Scintilla, and they're better spread out and put in mostly in the middle, where they're least likely to negatively affect the album in any way. Again, unlike Scintilla, which put most of its least memorable tracks near the end. So, overall, this is probably Plaid's best work in quite some time. The good stuff is really great, the mess stuff is still worthwhile. I'd be lying if I said this album was quite on the same level as those first three albums. While this album, like Ricci Prince, is more consistent than usual, the standout tracks don't stand out quite as much as the standouts from the first three albums. I do love tracks like Clock, Melifer, You Mountain, and When, but they're no X-Torque or Rakimu or IN. Not to mention, there's just not as much substance on the newer albums as there were in the older ones. For instance, Not for Threes had 17 tracks, at least the version I have does, and Double Figure had 19, while this one has 12. And also by comparison, Ricci Prince only has 9. You know, the more tracks, the merrier, I say. That being said, if you are a fan of Plaid, I definitely recommend checking this out, though if you are, I think you probably already heard it by now. And if you're not, well, I would recommend some of their earlier stuff first, as they're better in pretty much every way. I don't think Plaid is the kind of band that you need to listen to the earlier albums in order to fully appreciate the newer ones. Maybe you might even like some of the newer ones better if you start with them, who knows. Either way, I definitely enjoyed The Digging Remedy a lot, and definitely recommend checking it out at some point if you haven't already. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. Favorite tracks: Do Matter, Clock, The Bee, Melifer, You Mountain, Lambswood, and When. Least favorite track: Baby Step Giant Step. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I would like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.